Hello, my name is Melissa Foster. I'm an 8th grade science teacher at Castle Park Middle School, and I'm going to be presenting my findings from a classroom inquiry conducted this spring in 2016 on a smart tech use for equity in my classroom. To understand my equity vision, it first helps to understand the context of my students, school, and classroom. All of my science classes were SEI classes this year, which included English learners with a very wide range of English proficiency, as shown here. Additionally, as a department in the 2015-2016 school year, we wanted to put specific emphasis on literacy skill development that combines the requirements both of the Common Core and the NGSS. Across all content areas at our school site, we also standardized the text annotation process to make it much easier for the students. Finally, students are issued an iPad at the beginning of the school year, giving them access to the iPad both in the classroom and at home. With this context in mind, I began to wonder if there was a way to increase the access to scientific texts via specific tech use for my English learners, since there really was such a wide range of English proficiency within the classroom. This led to my forming of an inquiry question. I wanted to know, if I gave my English learners access to reading and annotating text on the iPad, would this increase their reading comprehension and overall level of engagement with the text? To test out my question, I first plan to use two distinct types of text, both on the iPad and on paper. Then, I will measure their reading comprehension and level of engagement via two means. First, I will look at their output writing samples, which you will see later on, and second, I look at the type and quantity of text annotations. I started by surveying my students on their reading preferences. As seen by this graph, student preference actually widely varies, and there's no standout with regards to how students prefer to read. I also asked students to justify their preferences from the survey, and this shows the summary of their written responses. You can see students who prefer the iPad think that it's easier to scroll, they don't need to actually buy supplies such as highlighters, they believe in it's the future of reading, they find it easier to make changes rather than erasing over and over on paper, they like it to be in color, they like that it's harder to lose work, and they like the options for highlighting. In contrast, the students who preferred paper had very generic responses, such as easier, more interesting, I'm used to it. There seemed to be a discrepancy. Some thought it was easier and faster to write on paper, and some thought easier and faster on the iPad. But overall, I did notice that there were a lot of comments that there's less distractions when students are reading on paper versus when they're reading on an iPad. I also asked students to communicate their preference for annotating on the iPad or on paper and came to generally similar results. Of one note, there was a slight increase of a little less than 10% for students who preferred to annotate on paper, which accounted for the drop in students who had no preference. The reasons for the student preference of annotation are shown here. For example, students who like to annotate on the iPad do so because they don't have to worry about their handwriting. They like that there's color options built in for highlighters on the iPad. Some find that typing and notability takes less time than writing, and they found it overall easier to correct mistakes. Students who prefer to annotate on paper generally thought it was faster, easier, for non-explicit reasons just better. It doesn't hurt their eyes as much as looking at an iPad screen. Some feel they can annotate more, show more, had less distractions, and are more familiar with it from elementary school. To be honest, the student preferences surprised me just a little bit based on my informal observations of my students reading and annotating in my classroom. As a result, I did want to conduct some classroom research based on my inquiry question and dig deeper into this topic. Do students increase their reading comprehension and level of engagement when they're reading and annotating on the iPad versus paper? Well, let's find out. The type of text I used in this inquiry included the picture text set and an informative article. First, as seen on the screen, the picture text set is a different type of text set than typically seen in science. It's an inquiry style of learning from a text, typically given at the beginning of the unit with new concepts, and students are required to develop understanding of a concept through the progressive use of color graphics. And they also have progressive written responses at the bottom of each of these graphics. At the end, students write a summary to demonstrate their learning, and the whole idea is that the students will arrive at their own understanding of the concept without having the teacher tell them what they need to know. Here's a sample of the picture text set I used during this classroom inquiry. As you can see, the text includes picture-rich text with analysis questions that ask the students to interpret what they see. Each subsequent picture builds on the knowledge the student developed in the previous picture. This continues, and the students are allowed to arrive at their own level of understanding rather than receiving information directly from the teacher. This is why it serves as an inquiry style of text. At the end of the picture text set, students were asked to write a summary of what they learned from the picture text set. What follows are 2 writing samples from students with varying levels of EL proficiency. This writing sample is from an ELD 1-2 student. Despite not yet having any exposure to the concepts of kinetic and potential energy, this student was able to communicate the basic ideas behind the 2 concepts. Similarly, this RFEP student was able to accomplish the same task, but with greater English fluency. My general findings from this picture text set use were varied. My ELD and EL students were definitely willing to engage more with this graphic-rich text than they were with a word-rich text. There seemed to be less of an intimidation factor in having less academic language immediately presented to them. I did notice, however, that despite this less intimidation factor, very few students were actually annotating the graphics themselves. They were foregoing their highlighting, circling, and writing in the margins that they had learned with previous forms of text, and really just limiting themselves to responding to the guiding questions below the pictures. I did really like that the iPad enabled graphic-rich text to be in color, that students who had printed copies of the version of the text set didn't have access to. I also noticed at the end that the summary showed that students who had varying English language abilities could independently arrive at the meaning of the academic language specific to the science concept, in this case, potential and kinetic energy. Finally, I also noticed that the students who were reading and writing on paper because they did not have their iPads notably summarized a lot less than students who were writing on the iPad. This took me back to my inquiry question. Did the access to reading this picture text set on the iPad increase the reading comprehension of English learners in science? Overall, I did think the level of engagement with this text was higher. I think this was mostly due to a lower intimidation factor, but I also am curious, did having this text set on the iPad directly increase and decrease the level of engagement, or was it just the type of text itself? In general, I did see that the picture text set was more engaging because it was less intimidating. I also saw that the students were more efficient in working through the text on the iPad, but overall, the quantity and quality of their annotations were lower. Summary responses on the iPad were also more detailed than students who were writing on paper. Notably, however, students who were writing on the iPad had more grammatical and spelling errors. More about this later. Finally, I did notice that I don't think students are really comfortable about bridging their knowledge of how to annotate a word-rich text, such as an article, and a graphic-rich text, such as these picture text sets. To look into my inquiry question further, I chose next to use a more traditional style of text, the informative article. As seen here, students knew standardized text annotations. These had been adopted school-wide in September of 2015, so my students were very familiar with the format for annotation expectations. These 2 pictures show the type of annotations made by the same RFEP student whose writing sample was displayed earlier. You can see both annotations summarize the gist on the left side, as well as more metacognitive type thoughts on the right side that include comments and questions. Together, these demonstrate a deep engagement with the text. Also, the summary represents a comprehensive understanding of how energy transfers during a roller coaster ride. The second writing sample is the same ELD 1-2 student from before. Though less complex, there is still amazing effort given to the quality of annotations, both on the left side, right side, and within the text. The summary also demonstrates overall conceptual understanding. In contrast, when students were given a subsequent informative article on the iPad about 1 month later, I noticed a large difference in the engagement with the text. On the left side, you'll see a text sample from the RFEP student, and on the right side, student from the ELD 1-2 category. These are the same students whose writing samples have been provided before. Overall, the annotations on the iPad seem significantly more limited mostly to highlighting, some very basic summarizing of the gist of a paragraph, but this is not a consistent practice. And overall, there's very little right side use in which students introduce their own thoughts, comments, and questions about the text. Again, I return to my inquiry question. Did access to reading informative text on the iPad increase the reading comprehension of English learners in science? Overall, I would say that the level of engagement measured by the quality of student text annotations was definitely higher on paper than it was on the iPad. However, I would like to qualify this finding. As the academic year progressed, I noticed that changes occurred in the effort given to text annotations, regardless of whether it was the iPad or paper. There seemed to be overall an increase in complacency with regards to text annotations. Partially may have been due to how I emphasized or did not emphasize expectations for showing these annotations. I think I made the assumption that as the year moves on, students better understand the expectations and would continue these practices. And so I did not make my expectations for text annotation as explicit in the assignment when students were working on the iPad compared to when I had them previously working on paper. With this basic data collected, I wanted to see if I could draw some conclusions. First, I do think that reading on the iPad offers some differentiation opportunities, such as changing the text size, changing the background screen color, having options of highlighter colors and such when annotating the text. However, in the end, the choice of being able to read and annotate on the iPad versus paper seemed the most important aspect. iPads did indeed support picture text sets or any text set that has a color-rich graphic scheme, but I did see that overall the iPad seemed to slow down the text annotation process of students due to the logistics of having to change text size and text boxes and go through the process of annotating on an iPad. I also thought that there were more distractions for students while they were reading on the iPad. For example, if they got an email or any type of notification, that notification would pop up at the top of their screen, and suddenly they were distracted from their reading. This did not happen on paper. However, overall, I would say there is nothing compelling that says definitively iPads are better for increasing the level of reading engagement and comprehension for English learners. How the teacher structures and communicates the expectations for text annotation, regardless whether it's on paper or iPad, matters more than the method of how the text is delivered to the student. This last bullet point is one I would like to dwell on just a little bit more as I close out this presentation. I started out this inquiry thinking, if I try a tech use, can I make an experience better for my students, specifically in the area of reading? However, what I found was having a tech tool doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work for my students. There is no magic bullet when it comes to technology. The most important thing that we can remember as teachers is how we deliver instruction, and the strategies we use during instruction still count for more than just having these neat tech tools at our disposal. I do agree that tech can definitely enhance instruction and sometimes even detract from it, but it's never a replacement for good planning and instruction. Also, I do take away that if I expect my students to read and annotate on an iPad, I need to teach them how to do that. Tech has its own literacy skill set, and I can't expect that my students will be able to bridge what they've learned on paper to the iPad. In the end, there's one question always worth asking when it comes to tech use. Why am I using it? If the answer to that question is centered on students and has equity in mind, then it's a good tech use. However, if the answer is something to do with maybe it's cool or it's neat or it's new and it's not student-centered, then in that case, it's not a good tech use. In this case, overall, I found the iPad sometimes benefited the students for reading engagement and comprehension, and sometimes it didn't. Thank you for taking the time to go with me on this journey of inquiry, and hopefully you've been inspired to learn something about your own classroom and your own students with regards to smart tech use for equity. Thank you.